When I was 12, my parents told me they were sending me to a 2-week summer camp. At that age, I was a total homebody, and I guess their plan was to push me into socializing so I wouldn't end up awkward and anxious. Looking back, I get why they did it. No parent wants their kid to grow up isolated and uncomfortable around people. I suppose the camp did make me more confident, but not in the way they expected. Saying I wasn't excited about going would be an understatement. The moment they broke the news, I nearly started crying. I pleaded with them, promising to be cleaner, more outgoing, whatever it took to avoid being shipped off to the middle of nowhere for 2 weeks. But they weren't asking, they were telling. I was going, no discussion. The night before I left, I cried myself to sleep. The drive to the bus stop was just as bad, tears threatening to spill the whole way. Only when I actually got on the bus with the other kids did I manage to hold it together, though that was more from fear than anything else. The bus was filled with loud, rowdy kids, and a small group even asked what my problem was. I just sat there, frozen, as they debated if I was special or something. It was humiliating, and I actually considered making a run for it at a rest stop. But where would I go? What would I do? There was no escape, and I had no choice but to endure it. The first few days were miserable. I barely spoke to anyone, the food was awful, and the activities felt like pure torture. I had been spoiled at home, eating what I liked, sleeping in my own room, enjoying my peace. Now, I was forced to sleep in a cabin with 5 other kids and eat whatever was served. It was a shock to the system. My anxiety was at its worst during meals, but not just because of the noise or the crowded dining hall. No, it was because of one particular girl. Her name was Emma. She was beautiful, confident, and the center of attention. I spent every meal stealing glances at her, until she looked my way, and then I'd stare at my plate, hoping she didn't catch me. A part of me wanted her to notice me, to talk to me. Another part of me was terrified that she actually would. One of those wishes came true. One day, during lunch, I heard a soft voice ask if she could sit with me. I was too stunned to respond, but Emma just smiled and sat across from me anyway. My heart pounded as she asked my name, where I was from, simple things like that. Seeing how curious she was about me, how some of the other boys shot me envious looks, it was the biggest confidence boost I'd ever had. For the rest of the day, I felt like I was floating. The next evening at dinner, she sat with me again. This time, I actually managed to hold a conversation. And by the end of the first week, after I'd made friends with 2 other quiet, nerdy kids, Emma came over to our table with a question that changed everything. She asked if I wanted to meet her by the lake that night. It was completely against camp rules. Boys and girls weren't supposed to meet up outside of scheduled activities or the dining hall. But that just made it feel more thrilling. The fact that she was willing to risk getting in trouble to spend time with me? Couldn't say no. That night, my friends wished me luck, gave me some last-minute advice on how to play it cool, and then I sneaked down to the lake. My heart sank when I didn't see her at first. Had she changed her mind? Was this some kind of joke? But I couldn't leave. I didn't want her thinking I had ditched her. Just when I was about to give up, I heard footsteps. Emma stepped out of the trees holding 2 towels. Talking to her alone by the water felt like a victory. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could actually fit in, like I could be normal. When she suggested we strip to our underwear and go for a swim, I didn't think twice. We waded into the water, trying to stay quiet. It was freezing, which at least gave me an excuse for my trembling nerves. At one point, she told me she swam competitively at her private school and could hold her breath for nearly a minute. She asked if I wanted to see. Of course, I said yes. She sank below the surface and I started counting. She popped back up at 50 seconds, gasping for air, and I was genuinely impressed. Then she asked how long I could hold my breath. I told her I didn't know, but I was happy to find out. I took a deep breath and submerged myself. I heard her counting, her voice muffled through the water. My lungs started burning as the seconds passed, but then she stopped counting. That's when I felt it, a hand on top of my head, forcing me down. I panicked, trying to push up, but the grip was strong. I wasn't the strongest kid, and the lack of air made it impossible to fight back. My lungs burned, my vision blurred. I thought, I'm going to die. For a moment, I fought harder, but then a strange calm washed over me. I stopped struggling. Everything faded. The next thing I knew, I was on the dock, coughing up water. A counselor was talking to me, asking if I could hear them. I was dazed, confused. Then I saw Emma. She was crying while another counselor comforted her. And then it all came back. The hand, the water, the feeling of drowning. Emma confessed everything. The whole thing had been a cruel prank, planned by some older kids to mess with me, but she hadn't expected them to actually try to drown me. The moment she realized what was happening, she ran for help. The paramedics and police arrived soon after. The camp staff took me into their office while everything was sorted out. The police called it attempted murder. The kids responsible were arrested that night, and the one who held me underwater ended up in juvie. The next day, my parents came to pick me up. My mom was furious, threatening legal action before dragging me to the car. I didn't cry when I left for camp, but I cried when I had to leave. I was relieved to go home, but I was also sad. Sad to leave my first real friends, sad to leave Emma. I know it sounds crazy. She was part of the prank, but she also saved me. In my 12-year-old brain, that meant she cared. Strangely enough, nearly dying at that camp was one of the best things to ever happen to me. Changed me. I wasn't afraid of people anymore. I made friends. I picked up new hobbies. I even lost some weight. The only downside? My fear of deep water. I haven't swum since, and just the idea of being on a boat makes my hands shake. Still, in a weird way, I'm grateful for what happened. Cost me something, sure, but it also gave me something, the courage to live without fear. Because now, I'm not afraid of the one thing that haunts most people. I'm not afraid of death. Anton Sokolov was born on January 15, 1940, in the mountainous region of the former Soviet Union. After a difficult childhood marked by the hardships of World War II, he eventually settled in the city of Novokras, near Stavropol. There, he built a family, having 2 children with his wife, Elena. To those around him, Anton was an exemplary citizen, a proud member of the Communist Party, and a dedicated leader in his community. He spent much of his time volunteering at a local youth club, organizing summer camps that gave hardworking parents a break from their responsibilities. Parents placed their trust in Anton, but that trust was tragically misplaced. He harbored a sinister secret, one that would only be discovered when it was far too late. In 1962, Anton was heading home from the center of Novokras when he witnessed a gruesome traffic accident. A drunken motorcyclist, speeding around a sharp bend, lost control and crashed into a group of pedestrians. One of the fatalities was a young boy dressed in a uniform belonging to the Soviet youth organization, similar to the Boy Scouts. The boy's body had been horribly crushed, yet his uniform remained largely intact. It was this image, not the blood, not the horror, not the chaos, that burned itself into Anton's mind. It awakened something dark within him, something he would later describe as an overwhelming and disturbing desire. Following this incident, Anton sought ways to be close to young boys without arousing suspicion. The perfect solution quickly became clear. He would become a youth leader, gaining the community's trust and using his position to carry out unthinkable acts. During the annual summer camps, he preyed upon specific boys, always between the ages of 11 and 15, always smaller for their age, and always impressionable enough to be easily manipulated. He convinced them to wear the same type of uniform the accident victim had worn, playing into his twisted fantasy. Anton would tell these boys that their short stature would lead to endless bullying and suffering. Then, once fear took hold, he would ask if they wished to be taller. Predictably, they always said yes. He then introduced them to an experiment he claimed would help them grow, by stretching their spine. In reality, it was a cruel and dangerous act that involved suspending the boy in a way that mimicked an execution. Anton assured them he would rescue them before anything went wrong. At times, he framed the act as a historical reenactment, where the boy would play the role of a Soviet martyr executed by enemy forces. Most of the time, Anton did revive his victims, but only after violating their unconscious bodies in ways they would never remember. However, in some instances, he did far worse. Over the course of 2 decades, Anton manipulated nearly 50 boys into his deranged experiments. 36 survived, though he forced them to keep their silence, often documenting the abuse through photographs. But in 7 cases, he let his dark urges take complete control. He would recall the sight of that lifeless boy from the accident, the convulsions, the broken body, the flames. And in these moments, Anton would mutilate his victims, starting with their heads, before burning their remains to relive his grotesque arousal. He kept their shoes as trophies, along with his disturbing photographs, using them to satisfy his urges and stave off the impulse to kill again, at least for a time. His first known victim was taken on June 10, 1965. 15-year-old Viktor Ivanov, a runaway, fell prey to Anton's twisted game. Anton later claimed Viktor's death was unintentional, that he had been unable to revive him after unconsciousness set in. Once he realized the boy was dead, Anton dismembered the body and buried it in the forest near the summer camp, burning the evidence in fear of being caught. A year later, in May of 1966, he killed again. His victim, Alexei Mikhailov, had been attending a nature retreat affiliated with a youth program that Anton helped lead. The photographs Anton took of Alexei satisfied his urges for 8 years, but eventually the hunger returned. On November 21, 1974, a 15-year-old boy named Oleg Stepanov vanished from the streets of Novokras. Investigators were unable to connect Anton to the disappearance. The same could not be said in 1976 when an 11-year-old named Andrei Petrov went missing after telling his mother he was going to be in a short film. She reported that Andrei had been invited by a man who claimed to be making a movie in the forest. This time, Anton's reputation as an amateur filmmaker led police to question him. However, as a well-respected figure, he was merely asked if he knew of any such film project. He denied any involvement, and authorities moved on. Shaken by the encounter, Anton refrained from killing for 5 years. But by 1981, his desires resurfaced, and he fixated on 13-year-old Sergei Morozov, who reminded him of the young boy from that long-ago accident. His final known victim was 13-year-old Pavel Romanov, taken in July of 1986. This disappearance was Anton's downfall. Pavel had told a neighbor he was going to meet a leader from the youth program Anton worked with. Since Anton was widely known as the face of the organization, an official investigation began. By November 1986, a Soviet prosecutor uncovered disturbing accounts from boys who had attended Anton's camps. Many spoke of unexplained blackouts, waking up sore and disoriented. When pressed further, they described Anton's so-called experiments. A horrifying narrative of abuse emerged, all pointing directly to him. In December 1986, police raided Anton's home in Stavropol and arrested him on multiple counts of murder. It remains unclear what tactics authorities used to secure his cooperation, but within a month, he led officers to the burial sites of 6 of his 7 victims. After his full confession, a Soviet judge was appalled by the scale of his crimes, sentencing him to death. For the next 3 years, Anton awaited execution on death row in a high-security prison. Then, in 1989, he was offered a final chance to save his own life. Authorities from Rostov Oblast sought his insight in catching another serial killer, a man who had already taken the lives of at least 29 children. If Anton helped, his sentence might be reduced to life in prison. The killer in question was none other than Andrei Chikatilo, later convicted of murdering 52 people. Anton did his best to assist, providing insights into his own twisted psyche, but his efforts were ultimately useless. Once authorities finished questioning him, guards dragged him to the execution chamber. As he pleaded for mercy, an officer placed a pistol to the back of his head and fired a single fatal shot. His reign of terror was over. In the end, Anton met a fate far kinder than any he inflicted upon his victims. Innocent boys who trusted him, only to be used to fulfill his dark and vile fantasies. And when the executioner pulled the trigger in September of 1989, the world became just a little bit brighter. During the summer break before heading to university, I traveled to the US through a program called Camp Exchange. For those unfamiliar, it's an initiative that helps young Europeans find temporary jobs as camp counselors in America. You pay a fee, and they arrange a position for you at a camp in your preferred region, whether the East Coast, West Coast, or elsewhere. I was placed at a camp near Santa Barbara, California, which was easily one of the most breathtaking places I'd ever been. Overall, my experience there was amazing and something I wouldn't trade for the world. But there was one camper who made it an unforgettable nightmare. His name was Oliver, and he turned out to be the most unsettling person I'd ever encountered. Not only that, but he committed one of the most horrifying acts I'd ever witnessed firsthand. From the start, we noticed something was off about Oliver. He had a habit of whispering to himself. One of the other counselors once asked him, "Oliver, who are you talking to?" She expected a response like, "No one," or "my imaginary friend," something innocent. Instead, he flat out denied whispering at all. She tried again, saying she had literally just seen him doing it, assuring him that he didn't need to be embarrassed. That's when he got defensive, almost offended, as if she were the one being unreasonable. He kept insisting that he hadn't whispered a word, and what made it eerie was how sincere he seemed. He wasn't just dismissing it to end the conversation. He truly acted like he believed he had said nothing. That was when we all started realizing Oliver wasn't a typical kid. One night, I was asked if I knew any spooky campfire stories. I decided to share a shortened, toned-down version of a classic werewolf tale, one of my all-time favorites. The kids were enthralled, caught up in the mystery of it. But once I finished, Oliver chimed in with something that sent chills down my spine. "I'm a werewolf," he announced, sounding oddly proud of himself. The other kids immediately started laughing. "No, you're not, Oliver. Werewolves aren't real." But Oliver wasn't backing down. He kept insisting he was, and that they were all wrong. The kids mocked him, teasing him relentlessly. And that's when I noticed something, the same eerie sincerity my fellow counselor had described. He didn't seem like he was trying to fool anyone. He actually believed it. That was already unsettling. But the real nightmare began later that night. Since the campfire stories were part of a wilderness excursion, we were sleeping outdoors in tents rather than our usual cabins. That meant I was physically closer to the kids than I would have been back at camp. Just as I was drifting off, a piercing scream tore through the night air. The valley we were in made it echo, amplifying the terror in it. Instantly awake, I threw on my boots, grabbed my flashlight, and scanned the area, trying to pinpoint the source. It wasn't hard. The only tent with its flap wide open was the obvious one. I ran over and saw a child's legs sticking out of the tent. At first, I thought maybe a spider or some other creature had scared them. But as I called out, asking what was wrong, I saw something I will never forget. The kid who had crawled halfway into another's tent slowly backed out, and when they turned their face towards my flashlight, I saw it was Oliver. He had an enormous, wild grin stretched across his face, and smeared across his lips, chin, and teeth was blood. For a moment, my mind refused to process what was happening. The reality of it was clear, but I couldn't believe it. Oliver had bitten another camper, one of the kids who had made fun of him, and he had bitten so hard that he actually tore into the flesh of the poor kid's leg. My instincts kicked in. I sprinted back to my tent, grabbing the first aid kit and my phone. As I rushed back to help the injured camper, my hands were shaking while I called another counselor on speakerphone. And then it hit me, a surge of fear. What if Oliver attacked me too? But when I reached the tent, Oliver was gone. He had bolted into the wilderness, probably realizing what he had done and fearing the consequences. I suggested that another counselor and I go searching for him, but the camp director immediately shut the idea down. "Let the authorities handle it," they said. We had all sensed something wasn't quite right about Oliver. We just never imagined how deeply disturbed he really was. Every counselor there, especially the ones with years of experience, agreed. He was the most unsettling, violent child they had ever encountered. I can't say for sure what happened to him, but from what I heard, he was placed into a facility for troubled youth. Meanwhile, the camp faced a massive lawsuit from the injured camper's parents for negligence. That was their financial horror story. But for me, I was left with something far more haunting, the memory of Oliver, the boy who believed he was a werewolf. Every town has its myths, and mine was no different. Ours was about the Shadow Man. Not the most original tale, I know, but what can you do? Almost everything is just a retelling at this point. The interesting thing about our legend, though, was that it had an actual place tied to it. The story goes like this. Back in the 1930s, there was a man in our town who was convicted of kidnapping and harming several children. Before he was executed, he swore he would never truly leave, that he would always be watching from the woods, waiting for kids who wandered too far from home. Parents still warn their little ones not to play too deep in the forest because the Shadow Man will take you. When I was younger, I believed it. Most of us did. But as I got older, I realized it was just a scary tale meant to keep us from getting lost. There was no way some guy from the 30s was still out there. The legend never faded, though, especially after a kid from our town disappeared a few years back. He was never found, but his backpack was discovered deep inside an old drainage tunnel in the woods. That tunnel was less than a mile from my house. My friends and I had been there plenty of times, using it as a meeting spot. We talked about going inside more than once, but none of us ever had the guts. We'd lift the cover, peek in, then quickly shut it again. A few weeks ago, I decided to finally check it out myself. Obviously, no one actually lived down there. It would be impossible. All my friends were busy that day, so I went alone. It was around 6:30 p.m. when I reached the tunnel. With a little effort, I pried off the cover and climbed down the ladder. The air was thick, but it didn't smell as awful as I remembered. Still, it was eerie. I flicked on my flashlight and started walking, looking for any signs that someone had been living down there. About 10 minutes in, I'd only seen a few rats. Nothing creepy, nothing strange. I was just about to turn around when I heard it. I wasn't alone. There was movement ahead, footsteps echoing through the tunnel. Then, I noticed another light coming toward me from the opposite direction. My heart pounded as I aimed my flashlight down the tunnel. "Hello," I called out. "Anyone there?" First, I saw nothing. My flashlight wasn't the best, and the darkness swallowed its beam. But the footsteps grew louder, and the other light glowed brighter. "Hey," I called again. "Who's there?" The steps stopped. I aimed my flashlight forward, and then I saw him. A man stood in the tunnel. His head was twisted at an unnatural angle, completely broken. He clutched an old lantern, its dim glow flickering against the damp walls. I nearly collapsed trying to scramble back. My body moved before my mind could process what I'd seen. I raced to the ladder, climbing faster than I ever had before, and slammed the cover shut the moment I was out. I fell back onto the ground, breathing hard, staring at the tunnel entrance. I ran through every possibility in my head. Maybe someone was messing with me? My friends knew I was going there. But would they really wait down in a tunnel for who knows how long? Just for a joke? That would take serious commitment. The only other explanation was one I didn't want to consider. A ghost. Everything fit, the broken neck, the location, the old lantern. It all matched the legend. Like I said at the start, every town has its myths. I just never expected to find out that mine was real. When I was a child, I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' home. Both of my parents had jobs that required frequent travel, so I was often left in their care. It wasn't as bad as some kids might think. Back then, the internet was slow and unreliable, so missing out on Wi-Fi wasn't even a concern. Kids like me spent most of our time outdoors. Hard to believe, I know. This particular memory takes place when I was around 10 years old, just a few days before Christmas. My grandparents had secretly let me open a present early, without telling my parents, of course. I still remember the excitement I felt when I unwrapped it. It was a brand new pair of binoculars. I had a deep fascination with bird watching as a child, and honestly, I still do. But back then, I had much more free time to indulge in it. My grandpa looked at me and said, I'll let you go into the woods to look for wildlife, but make sure you don't cross the river." Being a 10-year-old, I nodded without much thought and set off. The forest behind his house was enormous, and he owned all of it. At one point, my dad mentioned it was about 10 acres. As a kid, I convinced myself that I had explored every inch of it. Funny how imagination works. That day, however, my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. What I saw was real, and judging by my grandparents' reaction later, they knew it too. I had been walking for about 10 minutes, heading in as straight a line as I could while keeping an eye out for wildlife. I spotted a few robins and sparrows, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then I reached the river. It was completely frozen over, of course, but my curiosity got the best of me. I wondered what was beyond it and why I wasn't allowed to go there. The logical reason was safety. Once you crossed the river and went far enough, the house was no longer within sight or hearing range. But to my young mind, it felt like the perfect place to find a rare bird. I glanced back at the house a few times, debating whether or not to cross. I had nearly decided to obey my grandpa and stay put, until I heard a voice from the other side. It was a man's voice, but it wasn't scary. It was calm, warm, and inviting, like the narrator of a bedtime story. Caught my attention instantly. Before I even realized it, I had stepped over the ice and wandered deeper into the woods. After crossing, I didn't hear the voice again. I wasn't seeing any unusual birds either, so I started to feel like I had wasted my time. I decided to take one last look through my binoculars before heading back. The sun was beginning to set, and I knew if I stayed out too long, I'd get in trouble. I raised the binoculars and did a slow scan of my surroundings, and that's when I saw him. It wasn't a bird. It was a man. He was tall, dressed in a neat black suit, and holding a leather briefcase. Judging by the strength of my binoculars, he had to be less than half a mile away. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there. The longer I stared, the more I realized something was off. Why would a man in formal clothes be standing alone in the woods in the middle of December? I was so focused that I didn't hear my grandpa approaching. Suddenly, he grabbed me and carried me all the way back to the house, scolding me the entire way. Once inside, I sat on the couch as he questioned me, trying to understand what had made me disobey him. Through my sniffles and tears, all I could manage to say was, "I heard someone out there." His whole expression changed. I remember hearing him let out a sharp breath. He crouched down beside me and asked, "What did he say?" "He just said hello, and then he was gone," I whispered. I didn't see him until after I crossed the river. Almost in a whisper, my grandpa asked, "What did he look like?" "He was wearing a suit. He had a briefcase," I mumbled. I couldn't see his face. My grandpa exchanged a look with my grandmother, then turned back to me. No, don't worry, kiddo. We're not mad. We were just concerned." It wasn't until years later that I finally understood what I had seen. I was 18, and my grandfather's health had declined significantly. He wasn't close to passing, but he was very ill. We were visiting him in the hospital, and when my parents stepped out to grab some food, he told me the truth. Apparently, before the land was overgrown with trees, there had been an old cemetery there. The man I saw was a spirit that people called the gravedigger. He had been a businessman, hence the briefcase, but had suffered a fatal heart attack during his wife's funeral. Now, his spirit wandered the woods, searching for her grave. It was a tragic story, but that wasn't why my grandpa had been so worried. According to legend, if the gravedigger ever turned to face you, you would be cursed with an illness and eventually pass away from heart failure, just like him. I don't know if I believe all of that, but one thing's for sure. I'm glad he never turned around. The entire time, his back was to me. My grandmother eventually passed away, not from heart failure, in case you were wondering. But I've kept the story alive. I tell everyone about it. And whenever I visit that old house and see kids playing nearby, I always make sure to warn them, never, ever cross the river. I'm not sure how to begin this, so I guess I'll just come out and say it. I saw something in the forest. It wasn't a bear, and it sure wasn't some myth like Bigfoot. Anyone who believes that nonsense wouldn't believe what I saw anyway. And honestly, there are things I'll explain later that completely rule out those explanations. So if you're interested, stick with me. I was trekking through an old hiking path near my town in Nebraska, just enjoying the quiet, when I stumbled upon what looked like a deserted campsite just off the main trail. Normally, I would have ignored it and let the people in charge of maintaining the trail deal with it. I don't mess with things that aren't mine, but this was different. It wasn't just abandoned, it was wrecked. It didn't seem like someone just packed up and left. It looked like something had torn through it. The tent was ripped out of the ground and flipped completely over. Food was scattered everywhere. Even more disturbing, the fire pit still had embers glowing faintly, with little pieces of burning wood scattered around. That was the only reason I even walked over. I was worried a strong breeze could send sparks into the trees and start a wildfire. I carefully stepped in and stomped out all the embers, making sure there was no chance of a fire spreading. Then, I took a moment to scan the area, just in case whoever had been camping there was still around and maybe needed help. I walked a short distance into the trees, calling out to see if anyone would answer. That was my mistake. I had only gone about 20 feet in when I heard it. A deep, guttural growl coming from somewhere ahead of me. It wasn't like anything I had heard before. It wasn't quite like a big dog, but it also wasn't the kind of roar you'd expect from a bear. It had this strange, unnatural tone to it. I hesitated. A part of me told me to turn around and leave, but another part of me wondered if someone had been attacked and was still out there. If someone had gone through whatever wrecked that campsite, I felt like I had to at least try to help. As I moved forward, the sound seemed to shift, like whatever was making it was circling me, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe an animal had just torn through the campsite looking for food, and the growl was unrelated. But something still didn't add up. Most wild animals are afraid of fire. So how had the embers been kicked around like that? At that point, the unease was too much. I turned back toward the campsite, ready to leave. I didn't notice at first, but the growling had stopped the moment I started heading back. I didn't hear it again until I reached the edge of the clearing. And this time, I saw what was making the noise. I crouched near the tree line, hoping it wouldn't see me. It was enormous. Imagine a bear standing on its back legs, but completely hairless. That's why I know it couldn't have been a bear. They don't just shed all their fur like that. Plus, this thing was walking clumsily, but definitely walking. I watched as it wandered through the destroyed campsite, moving slowly, like it was still looking for food. When it didn't find anything, it turned and shuffled back into the woods. I didn't stick around after that. I hiked back to town and went straight home. Later, I tried researching what I saw, but I haven't been able to find anything that matches its description. I don't know if anyone else has ever seen something like it. I'll try to describe it better, but I'm working from memory. It was definitely bear-sized, but it wasn't a person either. It had no clothing, no human features, but also no obvious animal features beyond its small, rounded ears on top of its head and a long, narrow snout. If anyone has any idea what this thing could have been, I'd really like to know. It's been stuck in my head for a long time, and I never talked about it before now because I was afraid people would think I was crazy. Please, does anyone know what I saw? Years ago, when this happened, my original reason for being there was to study abroad. Once my education ended, I ended up returning because I loved the culture and simply enjoyed living there. I've since met someone and we're getting married this autumn. Life had been going smoothly, but last week, something happened that caused a lot of stress and tension in my relationship. It all started when an old friend of mine contacted me on a video call. He was an American like me, but had moved overseas to start a new life. He was 5 years older than me, had visited nearly every major landmark in the country, and had 2 kids. We were just casually chatting when, out of nowhere, he brought up a place called Hinoki Woods. I'm fairly certain most people have heard of it, but if you haven't, just do a quick search, I won't be explaining. Basically, he offered me $500 if I would camp there alone for 2 nights. My fiancée, who was born and raised here, strongly objected. She told me all the horror stories. People vanishing without a trace, spirits following people home, all sorts of eerie tales. I laughed it off, told her I wasn't afraid of some creepy trees, and accepted the bet. On the day I left, she begged me one last time not to go, but I was determined. I wanted to prove there was nothing to fear. Oh, and I really wanted that money, plus I figured it'd be an adventure. I kissed her goodbye and headed out. Approaching the forest, I felt something unsettling. While it had a certain beauty, there was also an undeniable sense of unease. The trees were packed so tightly together it felt unnatural. I had never seen anything like it. The moment I stepped inside, I felt like I had entered another world. The sounds of wildlife, bugs, birds, and other creatures were all around me. I could also hear the footsteps of a few other people nearby. The temperature had dropped noticeably. Though I wouldn't admit it to anyone, I was on edge. I kept telling myself it was just a regular forest and pressed on. Eventually, I found a flat, secluded spot to set up camp. By this time, it was around 7 p.m. Night one had begun. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept jumping at every little sound. I had no idea what kind of animals lived in this place, and given the forest's reputation, I couldn't shake the unease of knowing there were other people wandering around too. The next morning, I woke up groggy. I didn't even want to leave my tent. In fact, I wanted to leave the forest entirely. I decided to hike down toward the base of the nearby mountain just to see it for myself. Along the way, I took plenty of photos. I needed proof for my friend that I had actually gone through with it. I got some great shots of the wildlife, the dense trees, and all that. Halfway through my hike, I put my camera away. That's when I heard something soft sobbing coming from the east. Curious, I walked toward the sound to see if someone needed help. When I finally saw her, she was a young woman, maybe in her 20s. Beside her was an older woman, probably her mother, holding her close as she wept. They were kneeling in front of a body. It was heartbreaking. The older woman looked up and met my eyes. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. I could tell she was trying to stay composed, to hold back her tears. I gave her a small nod as if to say, asterisk, I understand. He'll be okay. Asterisk, and then I quietly continued on my way. I assumed the person lying in front of them was a family member, maybe a brother or father, but I didn't stop to look. I didn't want to. I just kept walking, trying to shake the image from my mind. I eventually sat down against a tree, thinking about everything, my fiancé, my friend, and most of all, this ridiculous challenge. After about 20 minutes of wrestling with my thoughts, I made my decision. I packed up and left the forest. Let me explain why. I had entered that place expecting a thrill, thinking of it as some eerie attraction. And sure, it was unsettling, but I had completely ignored what it really was. It was a place where people, in their darkest moments, came to end everything. I had been looking at it through the wrong lens, like some spooky Halloween destination, rather than what it truly was. It was disrespectful. Over the following months, I fell into a deep depression. Seeing how fragile life is, how quickly it can be taken away, whether by choice or not, is a sobering thing. It left me with a hollow feeling, making me believe that nothing really mattered. Get married, have kids, chase dreams. What was the point when it all disappeared in the end? That's where my relationship started to suffer. I wasn't as affectionate as before. My fiancé and I argued constantly. We stopped being intimate. At one point, we even got into a minor physical fight, and I stormed out of the house. And guess where I went? Back to that forest. I stood at the entrance, staring into it, thinking about everything I had seen and everything that had been weighing on me. I thought about going in, but I knew that if I did, I might not come back out. The thoughts I was having weren't good. They hit me in waves as I stood there. But then one memory came to mind, the older woman in the forest. I remembered how, despite the pain, she had held herself together. She was strong, and I realized that's what I needed to be, too. I went home that night and finally broke down, telling my fiancé everything. Eventually, I started taking antidepressants. Thankfully, they worked wonders. It's been nearly a year now, and I'm thinking of lowering my dosage. I haven't had a depressive episode in a long time, so I think I'll be okay. And yes, I did return to the forest. But before you ask, no, I didn't see ghosts. I didn't hear eerie whispers. Maybe I wasn't looking for them, or maybe they simply weren't there. I don't know, and honestly, I don't care. The real point I want to make is this. If you're planning to visit that forest, ask yourself why. If you're looking for a cheap thrill, just stay home. Calling it one of the scariest places to visit is like promoting a cemetery as some kind of haunted house attraction. I know this post doesn't fit the usual horror stories people share, but I needed to get this off my chest. What I saw in that forest was far scarier than ghosts or spirits. I saw reality. I saw what it means to lose someone you love, something I had never truly experienced before. So, if you ever consider going to Hinoki Woods, think carefully about why you're really going. And maybe, just maybe, reconsider. When I was 9, my parents signed me up for the Scouts. Now, despite what I'm about to tell you, I still think it was one of the best things I ever did. I loved spending time in the woods, learning survival skills and all that fun stuff. Since a big part of our training took place in the forest and involved wildlife, you'd expect me to have at least one eerie experience. Well, I can promise you that every Scout has at least one, and this is mine. By this point, I had been in the Scouts for about a year. That day, we were learning about different kinds of plants and leaves in the woods. I don't remember exactly what the lesson was about, but that's not the important part. When we finished, we were paired up and told to go find the biggest leaf we could. It might sound silly, but honestly, it was a lot of fun. We were given clear instructions not to go beyond the Scout leader's line of sight, but the kid I was paired with didn't care. He kept glancing back at the leader, waiting for the right moment, and the second they turned their head, he took off running into the trees. We had been taught that if we ever got separated, we should blow the whistle we were given. But in the moment, I wasn't thinking about that. I just ran after him, yelling, "We're not supposed to go that far." He didn't stop, though. He just kept running until finally he turned to face me. He was a couple of years older than me, maybe 11, so I wasn't that shocked when I saw a cigarette in his mouth. My parents smoked too, so I just assumed it was something older kids and adults did. "We need to go back," I told him. "I can't see the Scout leader anymore." He just laughed and took a drag from the cigarette. "Fine," I said. "I'll just call them over." I reached for my whistle, but before I could blow it, he smacked it out of my hand. "You better not get me in trouble," he warned, "or I'll mess you up." I took his threat seriously. I wasn't a big kid, and since he was older, I assumed he was stronger. He laughed for a second, but then his face suddenly drained of color. I thought maybe the Scout leader had spotted us, but it was way worse. He dropped his cigarette and bolted back toward camp without a word. I ran over and stomped it out before turning to follow him. Then I saw what had scared him so badly. For lack of a better word, it was a monster. It was huge, covered in thick, matted hair, and it smelled absolutely awful, like rotting meat. The fur around its face and hands was clumped together with what looked like dried blood. I was so terrified that I actually wet myself. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. Every logical part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but instead, I dove for my whistle on the ground. I snatched it up and blew as hard as I could. I'm lucky that thing was slow because it could have ripped me apart in seconds. The sound of the whistle made it let out a horrible cry before it turned and disappeared into the trees. Moments later, a Scout leader scooped me up, and soon enough we were all back at camp. The leaders gave us a serious lecture about forest safety. One thing I'll never forget is when one of them said, "There are things out there that can hurt you." It felt like a terrible thing to say to a kid, but deep down, I knew he was right. We kept going back to those woods after that, but I never saw anything like that again. I've been a park ranger for almost 5 years now. I don't feel the need to share my exact location, so please don't ask where these events happened. With that out of the way, I also want to make it clear that I'm no expert when it comes to the supernatural or strange creatures. I don't have explanations for most of the things I've encountered, but maybe some of you do. With that said, I'll start with the first strange experience I had while on duty in the forest. We received a call about a possible lost hiker. A wanderer is what we call someone who strays from the trails, either because they're lost or they're up to something they shouldn't be doing. I can't even count how many teenagers think it's a great idea to sneak into the woods to smoke. Anyway, I responded to the call and took the ranger paths to track down whoever it was. The description I was given was vague, tall and thin, not much to go on, but better than nothing. As I neared the end of a particular trail, I heard movement off to my left. I glanced in that direction and caught a brief glimpse of something colorful before ducking behind a tree. I called out, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here. This area is restricted to park staff only." No response, no movement. I started walking toward where I'd seen the figure disappear, but when I reached the tree it had gone behind, there was no one there. When you're out in the woods, it's not exactly easy to move without making a sound, and yet whoever it was had vanished without a trace. I radioed my supervisor to update him, and he told me to sweep the area once more before reporting back. After another thorough search, I still found nothing, so I did as he asked and returned to him. Then he asked me what color I had seen. I told him it looked like someone wearing a red plaid shirt with blue jeans. He chuckled. "That was probably Ben." I frowned. "Who's Ben? Does he just get to ignore the rules? Kinda hard to punish a ghost," he said, still amused. I gave him a skeptical look. Ben, he explained, had been a teenager who was mauled by a bear in these woods almost 15 years ago. Since then, he's been spotted more times than anyone could count. After that day, I saw Ben a handful of times myself, along with a few other strange figures. The most memorable was when I was giving a guided tour of the park's camping area. A small group was with me when a woman raised her hand. "Are we allowed near the river?" she asked. She pointed toward the bank, where I noticed a woman in a white nightdress standing at the water's edge. "Yes," I replied. "But if you're not a strong swimmer or underage, you're required to wear a life vest. The current is too strong for swimming, so it's just for safety." Then I called out to the woman near the river. "Ma'am, would you mind joining our group? You really shouldn't be down there alone." She slowly turned to face me, and as she did, I felt the blood drain from my face. Her eyes weren't there, just black, empty hollows. A few people in the group gasped. Some of the children clung to their parents, terrified. I glanced at the group, and they looked to me for an explanation, but I had none. When I turned back, the woman was gone. We finished the tour, but an uneasy tension hung in the air. Whenever people find out what I do for work, they always ask me the same thing. "Do you believe in Bigfoot?" The short answer? "No, I don't." The long answer? "There are far stranger things in these woods than Bigfoot. Things far more unsettling." Here's one of them. This will be my last story, as it might give away my location, and I don't want people coming here just because of these tales. If you visit, do it to appreciate nature, not to go looking for something spooky. So, one evening, I was out on patrol when something darted across the path in front of my vehicle. It was really just a golf cart. Thinking I had hit a small animal, maybe a fawn, I stopped and radioed in to my lead ranger. He asked me to describe it. I hesitated because I wasn't sure how to explain what I'd just seen. It was about the size of a large dog, maybe like a German shepherd, but completely black with a sleek, shiny coat. Its body shape was similar to a dog's, but it had no ears, not even marks where ears should have been. And it didn't have a snout. Not in the way some dog breeds have a pushed-in face, it just didn't have one at all. Its face was completely flat with only two thin slits where a nose should be. The lead ranger arrived soon after, and he was just as confused as I was. We called the wildlife conservation team, and they took it away to examine it. Later, some campers turned in pictures they had taken of the creature. The images made it into the local newspaper, but thankfully they never reached the news stations. The last I heard, there were no updates on what it could have been. I hope you found my stories interesting. Maybe they even remind you of experiences of your own. Depending on how people react to this, I might consider sharing more. But for now, I think I'll keep the rest to myself. We have summer camps for kids here in Canada as well, And the one time I attended, I experienced one of the eeriest moments of my life. I remember waking up in the dead of night and hearing something moving outside our cabin. I don't know what compelled me, but I got scared, thinking it might be a wild animal, maybe a wolf or something, so I opened the cabin door to check. Standing there in the dark was a strange man wandering through our campsite, silently taking our damp clothes from the drying line as he moved along. Our eyes met, and he raised a finger to his lips, making a soft sound. I was so terrified that I bolted back inside, dove into my sleeping bag, and stayed completely still, too afraid to make a sound or wake anyone up. Why would a grown man want to steal a bunch of little girls' wet clothes? Even after all these years, the thought of it still gives me chills. When I was 13, some kids from our church and I went to a religious summer camp for a week. It ended up being one of the worst experiences of my life. Besides how boring it was, I also got severe burns because they didn't bring enough sunscreen for everyone. Pretty much the entire week was miserable. I had skin peeling off my shoulders and the back of my neck. One of the only times I got any relief was during a river cruise we went on. It was an old paddle boat, and the main attraction was sailing into a huge lake where we could all go swimming. The boat didn't go out too far, probably for safety reasons, but that made what happened next even more disturbing. Some of the kids started jumping off the lower roof of the boat into the water. It wasn't that high, maybe 7 or 8 feet at most. I jumped a few times myself, and it was a blast. But then, a bunch of kids decided to jump at the same time, probably trying to make the biggest splash possible. I think around 6 or 7 kids jumped in at once, all landing in slightly different spots. But only 5 or 6 came back up. At first, I didn't notice. I wasn't part of the group jumping, and I wasn't counting heads. A few minutes later, some kids started asking, "Where's Danny? Has anyone seen Danny?" At first, no one was too worried. Maybe he went to the bathroom or something. But then an hour passed, and there was still no sign of him. One of the kids mentioned it to one of the camp leaders, and they started searching the boat. They checked every corner, but when they couldn't find him, they had to consider the terrifying possibility that he wasn't on board anymore. The leaders must have been panicking because no one thought to check under the water. It wasn't until the lake patrol arrived that they finally did, and that's when they found Danny. He had been trapped underwater the whole time, his leg caught on a jagged tree branch. He was too weak to free himself and had drowned while the others climbed back onto the boat. No one noticed the air bubbles rising as he screamed for help. Maybe because we just weren't paying attention. I'm pretty sure the camp shut down after that summer, probably because of the huge lawsuit that followed Danny's death. Only later did I realize how messed up it was that no one had really been supervising our swim, at least not the way they should have been. I kept thinking about how horrifying it must have been for Danny, stuck down there, bleeding and screaming while everyone else climbed out and kept playing. If someone had been watching closely, if they had noticed something was wrong, he might still be alive today. I used to work as a counselor at a summer camp in Georgia. I did it for 2 years in a row. The first year was great, so I decided to return the next summer. A lot of the same kids and counselors came back too, but we also had a bunch of new faces. Some of them were awesome, while others, not so much. And this whole story is about the worst of them all. Let's just call him Lucas because he was an absolute nightmare. From the moment he arrived, you could tell he was trouble. He was mean to the other kids, disrespectful to the staff, and had a mouth on him that no 10-year-old should have. We could handle difficult kids, but what we couldn't handle was someone who actually scared us. And over the next week, Lucas proved himself to be exactly that. There were 3 serious incidents with him, each one worse than the last. The first was a fight with another camper. Nothing too major, just a little scuffle we had to break up and document. Our head counselor called his parents and suggested they come pick him up, but they were on vacation and refused, even threatening to demand a full refund if we kicked him out. After that, we kept him separated from most of the other kids and placed him with others who were more difficult to handle. That worked for a bit, until it became clear that he was just making them worse. The second incident was deeply disturbing. One of the counselors went to check on Lucas and his cabin group. They were normally loud and rowdy, so the sudden silence was suspicious. When she walked in, Lucas and his little crew were huddled in a corner, focused on something he was holding. The moment she stepped inside, they scattered, and Lucas quickly tossed whatever it was under a bunk. She asked him to show what he had, but he refused, since we weren't allowed to physically take things from the kids unless they were in danger. She turned to the others and told them that if they told her what was going on, only Lucas would get in trouble. One of them just pointed under the bed. When she looked, she found a dead raccoon, or at least we assumed it was a raccoon from what was left of it. Lucas had apparently torn all the fur off and turned it inside out. His hands were covered in blood. The other kids' hands were clean, so they hadn't participated, but the fact that they just sat there while he did it was horrifying. Of course, we had to report it and called his parents again, telling them to pick him up or we'd report him for animal cruelty. They finally agreed but said they couldn't get back until the next day. That meant we had to keep Lucas under control for 2 more days. The only option was to exclude him from activities, but we couldn't exactly lock him up. The next day, the kids were taken on a nature hike to visit a local historical museum run by the Cherokee Nation. The campgrounds were originally part of Cherokee land, and we made it a point to teach the kids about its history. A big part of that trip involved a museum tour where the kids could see replica tools and weapons used during the Cherokee Wars. Lucas, normally uninterested in anything, was fascinated by one particular tomahawk on display. He even asked the museum guide, politely for the first time, whether the Cherokee actually used them in battle. The guide, not realizing who he was dealing with, explained that warriors used tomahawks not only for combat but also to take the scalps of their enemies. Lucas looked completely mesmerized. It was like something clicked in his brain, and I immediately got a bad feeling about it. But I never could have predicted just how far he'd take it. That night, after dinner, the kitchen staff was finishing up when one of them started accusing another of losing a knife. We overheard them arguing while we cleaned the dining hall. One guy kept saying, "Where did you put it? I'm not paying for that," while the other insisted he never touched it. Then someone asked which group ate last. When someone said the 5th graders, my stomach dropped. I just knew Lucas. I ran straight to his cabin, dreading what I might find. Just as I reached the door, I heard a terrible scream from inside. I burst in to see Lucas yanking another kid's hair with one hand and holding a knife in the other. He was about to scalp him. I shouted his name so loudly it startled him, making him freeze. I truly believe that if I had been just a few seconds later, he would have gone through with it. I could see it in his eyes, in the twisted grin on his face. For a split second, I worried he might actually lunge and try to finish what he started. Instead, he panicked and threw the knife under the bed, his signature move, then tried to slip past me like he was playing football. We caught him, locked him in the counselor's cabin, and finally did what we should have done after the dead raccoon incident. We called the police. When the officers arrived, they weren't even surprised. That alone was unsettling. But then we found out something even worse. Because Lucas was under 11, they legally couldn't arrest him. Instead, we were told to call his parents and make them pick him up immediately. The only good thing was that, since he was a danger to other campers, we had permission to keep him confined in the counselor's office until they arrived. The next morning, he completely trashed the place, but at that point, it barely even mattered compared to everything else. When his parents finally showed up, everything made sense. Their behavior, their attitudes, it was obvious Lucas hadn't been raised in a healthy home. Our head counselor mentioned that CPS would probably be paying them a visit soon. Either they'd lose custody, or Lucas would be sent somewhere for specialized treatment. I never found out what happened to him. I just hope, somehow, he got the help he needed. No kid is born evil, they're shaped by their surroundings. And judging by his parents, Lucas grew up in a very, very bad place.